Hello, I'm giving this talk from the land of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I'd like to thank the organizers of this year's Open House Melbourne program for inviting me to participate. The program this year is about celebrating and reimagining our waterways, which is a wonderful and exciting challenge. In order to think about creative futures for our waterways, it's useful to know something about how those waterways have been used and often abused in the past. My talk is about the ways that many of Victoria's rivers were affected by the gold rush. We don't generally think of rivers and the gold rush together, but gold mining has had a profound effect on our rivers and on the way that Australians think about water. As I'll show, what happened during the mining era still affects the health of the rivers and how they can be used. The gold rush is one of the defining moments in the last 200 years of Australian history, and the general outlines are familiar to all of us. There was the discovery of gold in 1851, the sudden arrival of hundreds of thousands of people from all over the world, and the madness as people left everything behind to grub in the dirt for promised fortunes. I want to take you a bit deeper than that. The word rush suggests a brief, intense craze that was soon over, and partly that's correct. There was a complete madness that didn't last long, and people did settle down soon in steady jobs to build homes and cities. But it's also deceptive to think about a rush in this way. Australia's mining industry was a long-term industry that profoundly influenced the colony of Victoria for 3 generations. Victoria didn't just have a gold rush, it had a resources boom. The industry here was particularly large. By 1914, over 2,500 tons of gold had been recovered. That's 2% of all the gold ever mined in the whole world. The scale of mining activity here was unprecedented and exceeded only by the Californian gold rush. In fact, in the 19th century, Victoria was bigger than California. In 1860, Victoria had a population of over 500,000 people, while that of California was only 380,000. So for 50 years, mining was the biggest game in town, just like it is today in Western Australia and Queensland. The mining industry had power and money and political influence. It was a society characterized by immense social upheaval and the reorganization of settlement and land use patterns, and the complete domination of one industry in the politics of the colony. To borrow from the historian Tom Griffiths, what I want to do tonight is to make the familiar strange. I want to astonish you with some of the things about the gold rush that I suspect you don't know, and I want to challenge you to use that knowledge to think just a bit differently about what we do today. I have to start by confessing that I'm not actually a historian. I'm an archaeologist. I don't spend much time in the archives. My data are the ruins and the abandoned junk of the past, and I spend a lot of time in the bush looking at them. For me, this particular story about the past started with something so subtle, it actually took me 2 decades to realize that I was seeing it at all. What I really started to look at for the first time about 10 years ago was features like this that you're looking at now. A water race, a ditch to carry water. They're actually pretty common in Victoria. Every old mine has them. They're everywhere. I've been wandering around old mining sites all over Australia for a very long time, but it's only in the past decade that I seriously started to wonder about these races and what they had been used for. These races are all about water. Mines use a lot of water. Nearly 4% of all water used in Australia today is used by the mining industry. And in the 19th century, mining was by far the biggest user of water in the colony. Gold miners used water in several ways. They used it for panning golds, they used it for puddling, they used it for sluicing, and for crushing the ore. In fact, they used it for all of the different things that today we would use more mechanical processes for in many cases. Water was the motive power, and it was what was used to separate the gold from the surrounding rock and earth. So mines used a lot of water. But how did they get that water? Australia is very dry. It has very few lakes, it has only small rivers, and most of the rain is seasonal. So in a global sense, we don't have a lot of available water. The miners quickly started to build dams and races in order to provide the water that they needed. By the late 1860s, over 4,000 kilometres of waterways had been built in Victoria. That's enough to stretch from Melbourne all the way to Perth. All of these water races were built by private investors. The only public system of any size in Victoria at the time was the Yan Yean system to provide water to Melbourne. The big Coliban scheme to provide Bendigo and Castlemaine wasn't completed until 1877. So these were all private water supply systems. One of the earliest in the state was Kirk's Reservoir up at Ballarat, which was built in 1858. Others in the area were built at the same time, and Ballarat and Creswick were in fact at the forefront of this management of water, along with Beechworth and other parts of Victoria. By the 1870s, races and dams that were managed and owned by these private companies were able to supply 1.1 billion litres, or 1.1 gigalitres of water every day. And that is a significant amount of water. The reason they were doing this is because there was money to be made. The first water race in Victoria was built by John Riley at Beechworth in 1853. Riley was a miner and an engineer. He diverted water from the creeks around Stanley into his own rich claim and made a fortune by doing that. Then he realized that he could make even more money by selling the water. One of his neighbors 60 years later recalled that Riley had made virtually 100 guineas a week from selling water, and Riley himself claimed to have made between 50 and 80 pounds per day from his water supply. Water quickly became big business. Over £200,000 were invested in water infrastructure in the 1850s, just around Beechworth. So an amazing amount of money being spent on these things. As an archaeologist, I did a lot of work with my colleagues recording old race networks in the bush around Beechworth and Creswick and Castlemaine. And these systems are impressive engineering feats. They divert water across watersheds and between river catchments. Miners built siphons and flumes and tunnels to carry the water where they wanted it to go. Many of these schemes were so successful that they later provided a foundation for the municipal water supply schemes that still operate in many of these regional towns. At Creswick, for example, we documented over 160 kilometers of surviving water race networks. We used water license files from the Public Record Office and GPS data that was generously shared with us by Kevin Tolhurst. The longest race in the Creswick area is the Smoky Town race, which took water for over 26 kilometers from up in the hills south of Creswick, well to the northeast, to the workings where the gold was being mined. So these are very long, very complicated, and sophisticated water supply networks. This led us to wonder, what gave these water merchants the right to be selling water at all? And they were water merchants. To begin with, of course, they had no right. The English tradition of rights to water is based on something called the riparian principle. Those who owned the adjacent land could take the water for their needs. Water was abundant and widespread in England, so that generally worked. But mining in Victoria needed a lot of water, and when mining began, no one owned the adjacent land. The Crown had taken it from the Aboriginal people, but it hadn't yet sold that land. So, as far as the government was concerned, the land was owned by the Crown. In California, miners facing the same situation developed the principle called prior appropriation. Whoever got to the stream first and claimed its water had the right to it. And that still governs water allocation in the American West today. Neither the riparian principle nor prior appropriation really worked quite right in Victoria, and gradually people here worked out their own entirely new way of managing water. Miners around Creswick and Ballarat, and especially those up at Beechworth, spent much of the 1850s and 1860s in court arguing about water rights. They fought in the streets too. We found lots of reports of violence as miners assaulted each other to get control of water. They fought with each other on the streets and in the diggings, and they snuck out at night to steal water from their competitors. Up at Beechworth, full-scale riots erupted between German and Chinese miners as they fought over who had the right to the water. Finally, in 1862, amendments to the Mines Act allowed licenses for water to be granted for 15 years. This was confirmed and clarified 3 years later in the Mining Statute of 1865, which spelt out water rights in detail. These new laws separated the right to water from ownership of land, and they disrupted that English common law system that was hundreds of years old. But they also rejected the California-style system of exclusive privilege to water. Instead, the miners confirmed that water was a public resource that was ultimately owned and controlled by the state or the government on behalf of everyone. In turn, the state made the water available for a fixed period. So in this wrangling, the miners established a new relationship with water for a new country. And this new relationship had a profound significance in later years as the basis for the irrigation agriculture industry, and today as the underpinnings for the Murray-Darling Basin scheme. Well, so far, so good, you're probably thinking. An interesting, but perhaps a bit esoteric history lesson about the gold rush. Not terribly relevant yet, though, to the theme of waterfronts. That's about to change. Because after that water had been brought to the mines, it all ended up in the rivers. This is a couple of images of some gold mining remains up at Tavistock Hill in the Creswick State Forest. And on the left is a picture of the pit that the miners excavated using water. And on the right side is the drain that they used to flush out all the water, the wastewater that they'd used. And that wastewater ended up directly in all of the nearby rivers. That wastewater that was discharged from the mine at Tavistock and many others around the colony included huge quantities of sand and gravel and silt. That water flooded roads and businesses and farms and homes, even for tens of kilometers downstream from the mines. It's what miners call tailings, the waste materials left after processing the minerals. Back then, people called it sludge, and sludge was a huge problem in colonial Victoria. It was a controversy that raged for 2 generations until the eve of the First World War. You can see the effects of sludge here in this image, which is actually from the 1950s, I think, from a tin mining area in Gippsland around Tura. And even though it's a bit later, it's showing exactly the kind of thing that was going on in the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s, and so on. You can see how this silt and mud has just flooded out over the entire floodplain here, and how it's killed the vegetation and just really smothered everything. So sludge was a huge problem in Victoria for a very long time. They called it the sludge problem. And when we looked on Trove, which is the National Library of Australia's online repository of old newspapers, we found thousands and thousands of accounts in newspapers of the time about sludge. People complaining, editorials, letters being written, and so on. This is just a sample of some of them and some of the things that they said about it. One of them talks about the sludge rolling down like a lava tide upon the cities of Ballarat and Sandhurst, threatening to submerge them and preserve them like Pompeii or Herculaneum. Another one is by a farmer who writes that for miles along the creek, the sludge and the mullock is being spread over the farms. It's ruining land and destroying crops, annihilating fences, bringing dire destruction. In some places, the land that was once grain-yielding and valuable is covered from a depth of from 6 to 10 feet, and that's in the 1870s. Another farmer says, "A number of my neighbors' stock have died. I believe it's through nothing but drinking this water. It's an accumulation of sand in their intestines." So a massive problem in all kinds of different ways. What we found, though, when we started to do some more research, is that it's not just a local problem. This image here shows the results of work that I did with some colleagues on the Rivers of Gold project, where we went through the records of the mines department and were able to calculate the quantity of tailings that were being discharged in each mining district over this period from 1859 to 1950. And when we added it all up, a conservative estimate is that over 850 million cubic meters of tailings were discharged into Victorian rivers. The different circles that you can see on that image, the pie charts there, show the relative quantity of sludge in the different parts of Victoria. So you can see that the most sludge was being discharged into the rivers in the northeast around Beechworth and up on the Midamidda and the Upper Murray. Ballarat, Bendigo, Castlemaine all had lots of sludge going into rivers there as well. The different colors are from different types of mining, and that's relevant when we think about rivers because different types of mining produced sludge of different consistency, from really fine clays and silts up to large chunky gravels. So what we can see by this graph is that a lot of sludge was produced and it was very widespread. One of the things that we also began to realize was the impact of dredging. And dredging was a new way of mining that began in about 1900. Dredges were these floating factories that were developed in New Zealand and brought over to Victoria at the turn of the century. The way that a dredge operated was it had a bucket on one end out here, and that bucket would dig into the bank in front of it. The sediment would be put on a conveyor belt and moved through this big long shed where it would go through a series of machines that would separate out the gravels and the sands from the gold. And then at the back, there's another chute where the refuse would be deposited out the back onto the sandbanks. So dredges were a very popular way of mining in the early years of the 20th century. And what we began to realize was that dredges were so efficient at working low-grade ores that, in fact, they were producing many more times sediment than all the other kinds of mining put together. This is just a graph showing the number of bucket dredges operating at any one time and the yield of gold that was being produced. And you can see by the 1950s, there were hardly any dredges operating, but they were still producing a very high volume of sludge. So lots of different kinds of mining that were all producing this waste material. Let's have a look in more detail at one particular system so that we get a sense of the sources of sludge that are going into the rivers. So this is a map of the Loddon River catchment. You might not know that river. We're not good with rivers in Victoria, but you probably know a lot of the places in its catchment. The tributaries of the Loddon begin up around Castlemaine, around Barker's Creek and Friars Creek and Campbell's Creek. And of course, that's all part of the Mount Alexander goldfield, which for a time in the 1850s was the biggest alluvial goldfield in the world and a large producer of sludge. Other tributaries are Jim Crow Creek from Dalesford and Sandy Creek that come down from Malden. Both of these drain large goldfields as well, big producers of gold and big producers of sediment. Another major branch of the Loddon is over at Creswick. Creswick Creek, Deep Creek, or Tullaroot Creek, different names of that branch. It all drains the hydraulic sluicing at Creswick, the deep lead mines on the plains around Smeaton, and then the quartz mines at Clunes. And again, the Clunes and Smeaton mines in their day were also some of the richest in the world. Over to the west, Bet Creek flows into the Loddon from the goldfields of Maryborough and Denali, and finally, the Wedderburn and Inglewood mines also drain into the Loddon. So all the sediment from all those goldfields was going straight into this one river system, at least 80 million cubic meters of sediment. And that's why the rivers had a problem. It wasn't just the Loddon, though. We began to calculate the distribution of sediment by looking at the testimony from an inquiry into sludge that was held in 1887. During that inquiry, the government visited 17 communities from Omeo to Maryborough. They took 159 pages of testimony. And we put it on a map by looking at the places where people, the witnesses, were complaining about sludge damages, and then tracing back upriver to where that sediment was coming from. And you can see from these red lines on the map that rivers all over Victoria were being affected, and that for many of those rivers, the complaints ranged all the way from people down at the very mouths of the river, the ends of the river, right up to the mining areas in the headwaters. So very, very extensive. The mines at Bendigo were sending all their sludge into Bendigo Creek, and that ended up all the way downstream west of Rochester and Elmore. The Heathcote mines drained into the Campaspe. Sludge went into the Goulburn River up around Woods Point and Jameson. It went into the Kiewa River and the Upper Murray River. It went into Gippsland rivers as well, particularly the Thompson and the Mitchell and the Tambo. One of the worst affected rivers was the Ovens in northeastern Victoria, and that was the location for a long-running battle between farmers at Tarrawingi and miners at Beechworth. Around Ballarat, the mining sludge drained into the Yarrowee and the Moorabool and the Wody Yallock, and eventually down into the Barwon. Around Melbourne, mining sludge was going into the Yarra upstream at Warrandyte. So all over Victoria, people were experiencing sludge, and they were complaining about it. There are some really good descriptions that tell us exactly what all of this sediment was doing to the rivers. Here's one report, which is from the Loddon, downstream from Clunes. Albert Bucknell talking about water holes from 30 to 40 feet deep being filled in. And again, how in some places, the billabongs have all been filled in with sand. Sometimes that has become the creek itself, and the old bed is filled up with sludge and has straightened itself out. Up in the northeast near Wangaratta, somebody's reporting about a fence that's had to be re-erected 3 times, one above the other. The first one on a level with the original creek. That creek got flooded with sludge. A new fence had to be built on top of it, and then a third fence on top of that one. So you've got 6 to 10 feet of sludge in that location. And along the line of Deep Creek, again over near Clunes, the trees have all been killed by the water being discharged from the mines. So we've got billabongs being filled in, water holes being filled in, the creeks are being straightened, and the vegetation along those creeks that's being killed. So lots of different effects, not just in rural areas though, also in towns. This is a map done by a PhD student working with me, Greg Hill, showing the contour levels in Ballarat, where the innermost, the downtown part of Ballarat has also been submerged by sludge. All of those green areas that you can see in the map are places where up to 3 meters of sludge have covered the original contours of the land. And that's down at Bridge Road, the end of Main Street, down where those big Coles and Woolworths supermarkets are these days in the center of Ballarat. So, a huge problem for all of those businesses that you can see in there as well, who had to keep raising their businesses and raising the level of the road to be above this sludge. And that went right on the problems with sludge in Ballarat being discharged there, went right on into the early 20th century. The road south from Magpie, or at Magpie between Sebastopol and Buninyong, was still being flooded by sludge, in 1909. So this is something that went on for a long time. So you might be starting to think, well, this is going on for so long. What is being done to stop it? Surely people would have been having some kind of action. And indeed, they were complaining, they were protesting. But for a long time, the sad answer is that not very much was being done. Mining was big business, and neither industry nor government was terribly interested in interfering with progress. As early as 1859, a group of orchardists and market gardeners north of Bendigo tried to get compensation for thousands of pounds worth of damage that had been done to their properties from the Bendigo mines. and the Commissioner of Public Works responded quite bluntly that they did not consider the claims to be a legitimate demand upon the government. They were the inevitable result of the proximity of the claimants to the gold washings. So basically, it was their own fault for being located downstream from the mines. However, the farmers continued to fight. They got court injunctions where they could, and they had numerous official inquiries. This is just some of the inquiries they had. The biggest was in 1886, but there were many of them. However, the industry was still too powerful, and nothing was done. It wasn't until the turn of the century that the farmers finally began to make some headway. And then it was with the help of this man, Sir John Bowser, who was the MLA for Wangaratta and eventually Premier in his own right. By the turn of the century, mining was in decline and agriculture was growing in significance economically. The irrigation industry was also starting up, and the government had invested millions of pounds in infrastructure for agriculture. They'd built weirs on the Loddon and the Goulburn, and channels like the Waranga to carry the water to the farms. One government minister put it quite bluntly to a group of anti-pollution campaigners when he said, "The future of the country depends on irrigation and water supply." What's really significant is that that government minister was Donald MacLeod, who was the Minister for Mines. So at last, the writing was on the wall. It was really John Bowser, though, who was the hero. Bowser's better known as an advocate for farmers, and as part of the farmers' union movement, he later became Premier. But he was a landowner himself, up along the Ovens River at Millawa. He was part of a dedicated and vocal group in that region, who had been speaking out against mining waste since the 1860s. In 1902, Bowser introduced a private member's bill to curtail sludge. It didn't get anywhere, but it did get the attention of his colleagues. And in 1904, Bowser's provisions were picked up in a new bill to amend the Mines Act. All hell broke loose, of course. Is the great industry that has done so much for the country to be penalized on account of providing an occasional afternoon's fishing during the season? Was the response from one pro-mining newspaper. But Bowser and his allies stuck to their guns. Bowser told Parliament that an obligation is laid upon this House to see that the injury now being done is not continued and is not to be written permanently on the face of this state. Legislation was passed in 1904 and strengthened in 1907. And that legislation at last led to some serious action to prevent mine tailings entering the rivers. The miners had to take responsibility for their waste. They started building tailings dams and even doing some remediation. Something called the Sludge Abatement Board was established to monitor compliance. And these were really revolutionary actions for the time. Victoria now had Australia's first anti-pollution legislation, and Victoria's mining industry now started to pioneer the regulations and techniques that still guide mining all over Australia to this day. Sadly, though, it was too late for Victoria's rivers. The damage had already been done, written on the face of the state, as John Bowser had feared. We know this because we've been out into the bush and found these rivers where the sludge has been deposited. This is really where we get to waterfronts and the theme of this year's events. Because now we're looking at what the sludge actually did to rivers and how it matters now. We're studying this through the Rivers of Gold project, and this is my colleague Ian Rutherford from Melbourne University, standing in Hodgins Creek up at Tarrawingi, near where John Bowser had his farm. Ian is pointing to the boundary between the earlier grey floodplain soil and the buff-colored sludge material on top of it that is all the mining waste that's come down from the mines up around Beechworth. We've been visiting rivers all over Victoria, and we've found that it's frequently visible like this, as Ian is pointing to. We've found places where the sludge is still lying 1.5 to 2 meters thick over those floodplains. So this is up near Tarrawingi, west, east of Wangaratta. These are another couple of places, the Loddon River at Berringup, which is west of Malden, and the Yarrawee River south of Ballarat. In all of those places, you can see the same thing. There is that lower grey floodplain soil, which is the original soil along that river, and above that is the buff-colored sediment from the mining, all of that sludge that's got there. We've also found that this sludge is still present miles downstream from the mines. This is at Shelford, and the picture on the left is showing the Lee River there at Shelford, south of Ballarat in 1909, when farmers were complaining about sludge coming down from the mines in the most recent floods for them, so still, right in the early part of the turn of the century. And you can see how that sludge has covered the banks and the floodplains, and you can see how all of the trees and vegetation along the watercourse have been killed by it. The image on the right is from 2019 when we revisited that location, a different dog, but still a dog on the farm. And what you can see there is, yes, it's covered by crops, but you can also see a faint line just in front of where the dog is standing, where there's a difference in vegetation between the crop where the dog is and the crop closer to the riverbank. And that is where that sludge is actually still there underneath as forming part of the topsoil that is being worked on this farm. So we can see the effect of sludge still then on these floodplains. We can see it in other ways as well, because it's not just the sludge, it's all of the digging and excavation that the miners did. This is near Guildford, which is west of Castlemaine. And what we can see in this picture from the 1850s is the way that the miners have completely turned over this area. This is what the Djadjurrung people, who are the traditional owners of this country, call upside down country. Because if we look again at an image from when we visited in 2018, this is that exact same location, and it now looks like a perfectly normal paddock. It looks like an ordinary bit of the floodplain of the river. But in fact, it isn't. It's completely upside down, as the Djadjurrung know. We can also see how the sludge has completely changed the functioning of the river systems. If we look at the image on the left, the diagram, you can see up at the top what the river systems would have looked like to begin with, when many Victorian rivers had multiple shallow channels and the water was able to spread out over a wide area. There'd be some deeper water holes in that, but the river was spread over a larger area. So when it flooded, that water would be able to bring the soil and the nutrients down to the floodplain, and the water itself would be able to percolate down into the aquifers. In the middle of that image, you can see what's happened during the mining period when the sludge has filled up all of those shallow channels and it's flooding out over the floodplain, and any water that comes along is trapped at that upper layer and just goes straight through and spreads out even further onto the floodplain. Down at the bottom of that image, we can see what's happened after mining has stopped, when the river starts to erode down into a deeper channel again. And that's what's happened in lots of Victorian rivers now. The river actually sits in a bit of a sort of a tunnel with these high banks on either side, and you can see the image of that on the right hand side. And what that means during a flood situation is that the water is now conveyed really efficiently through the system. That deep river now acts as basically a drainage channel, just carrying the rainwater away. So it's not flooding out on the floodplain to leave the silt and the nutrients behind, and it's not allowing the floodwaters to sort of soak into the aquifer either. So it's a very different way of the river functioning. We can also imagine there in that the middle and lower parts of that image that any seed that was originally on those riverbanks is now covered by all of that sludge, because the riverbank that we see today is not the riverbank that was originally there 150 or 200 years ago. So if people are trying to revegetate riverbanks, that's something that's really important to bear in mind, that the seed bank is not on the surface anymore. It's been buried by all of those mine tailings. So the functioning of the rivers has really changed. Another thing that we have found in our research was looking at dredging and the way that has affected rivers. And I mentioned the dredges that were brought in around 1900 or so. This image shows one around Bright, and it also shows the area around El Dorado that was dredged extensively too. You can see that whole area there in that photo has all been dredged. And dredges could work up to 40 meters below the ground surface. So they were really, really churning up the ground where they were. We looked at some of these places using LiDAR imagery, which is a kind of aerial photography that allows you to see the contours of the ground. If you look at image A, that's a normal aerial photograph of part of the Ovens River Valley, and the modern Ovens runs through the center of that image there where the trees are. Image B is looking at that image through LiDAR, which is showing the contours, and the different colors show different elevations. The dark green is a lower elevation, and the orangey pinky is sort of a higher elevation. And what you can see there is that north of the river, in the upper part of that image, it's much higher, and that's the original floodplain. And down below is where it's all been churned over by the dredging. We can look at that in detail in the lower two images. Image C shows that dredged area in close-up, and you can see the channels there where the dredge has been working are still really evident. They're really clear. And in image D, that's the undredged part, where you can actually see the original, one of the old paleo channels or former channels of the Ovens still there on the floodplain. So that's a very different kind of situation for that land today. The part that's been dredged has been much more disturbed than the part that hasn't been dredged. And, you know, they might still look like they both have vegetation on them, but one of them will operate very differently than the other. And that actually does have implications for modern land use. In the next image, this is showing an area again along the Ovens up near Freeburg, just a paddock on the floodplain. But you can see, looking at that image, there's not very much vegetation. It's very sparse. The soil is really gravelly and has, you know, these big chunks of stone and things there. It doesn't look like very good soil at all. We did a bit of analysis just looking at land use patterns where there had been dredging, and we found that in most of the places where there had been dredging, the land was being used for forestry, or was just scrub, or was woodland. And all of those things are much lower value uses. That woodland wouldn't be a nice, rich, biodiverse original woodland. That would be some sort of probably very weedy woodland. All of those are much lower value uses than grazing or cropping, and it's only 13% of those dredged areas that can actually be used for cropping. What's really important about that is that these are the floodplain soils, which we would normally expect to be the most productive and most valuable in an ecosystem, and in fact here they're very, very significantly degraded. The next image shows, again, the significance of these changes to land use and what the land can be, what can be done with it, how productive it is, because dredging was not something that was isolated. In some areas, and particularly along the Ovens, it was really widespread. We actually plotted all of the mining leases, the dredging leases that were taken out in the Ovens Valley. They are the areas that show up in white on this aerial image. And you can see that they run pretty much continuously all the way from Harrietville almost down to Myrtleford. So that entire belt of the Ovens has had significant impact from dredging on it. Another impact from the mining has been in something called sand slugs. And sand slugs are just a plug of gravel and sand that sits in the river channel and that gets moved downstream gradually every time there's a flood. And the two top images there are from Reedy Creek near Wangaratta. And the one on the left shows the front end of that slug that's moving down Reedy Creek. So there's still a bit of water in the creek, and then there's that sand slug acting almost like a bit of a dam. The image on the right is standing on top of the sand slug, and you can see that it's really level and uniform. When the water flows down there, there's no habitat for fish or insects or plant life or anything. It's just a sandy desert, really. And the flood water just, when water's high enough, it flows over that. And the one on the lower part of that image is from the Loddon River. And again, you can see there the gravel that is flowing around all of the trees and choking the vegetation in the Loddon at that point. So sand slugs also, have a significant impact on the functioning of river systems. The final thing to talk about in terms of the effect of sludge on the rivers is the impact on cultural heritage. And one of the things that the sludge has done, yes, it's buried the seed bank, it's also buried the cultural heritage. And in this image here, we can see on the left part of the bank of the Loddon River that's been covered by sludge. On the right, you can see 3 pieces of pottery. 2 of them are Chinese pottery, and 1 is a piece of English transfer printed pottery. They're all probably from about the 1850s or early 1860s. They probably come from up around Guildford, which is about 10 miles upstream from this point. We found those pieces of pottery right down at the bottom of that layer of sludge. So they were still sitting there where they had come down the river, been washed down the river in the late 1850s, and they've been buried by all those layers of sludge ever since. And in fact, what the sludge has done is it's given us whole buried landscapes. This image is from up near Bendigo along Huntley Creek, and you can see on the left there's another nice shot of the orange clay. There is the natural floodplain soil, and the lighter buff-colored material above it is the mine tailings, which covers that whole paddock and goes well back from Bendigo Creek. On the right-hand side is showing some of that buried landscape. You can see a layer of gravel right in the middle of that soil profile on the right. And underneath it is the orange floodplain, and above it is the mine tailings. That gravel is probably a load of wash dirt that was brought down from a miner, probably in the early 1850s. He's brought it down to Bendigo Creek so he could wash the gravel and recover the gold. And when he was finished, he just tipped out the gravel in that little pile next to Bendigo Creek. And then in later years, subsequently, it was covered by all the tailings that lie above it now. So you can imagine that whole paddock, and in fact all of these floodplains still contain beneath them the buried landscape that was originally there in the 1850s. I've talked about a couple of examples of non-Aboriginal heritage, but you can imagine as well significant implications for the Aboriginal artifacts that have been buried by this sludge too, and how it's probably preserved them underneath there. So when we understand that a lot of these floodplain soils now are in fact mine tailings, that means that we have to think about how we manage them in really different ways to what we might have done otherwise. And that really brings me to the end of what I wanted to talk about with rivers and the gold rush. That's the story we found about how mining has impacted the rivers. The gold rush is a story that we think we know pretty well in Victoria. We think we're familiar with it, but in fact we're only just beginning to understand the lasting environmental impacts that mining has had. Rivers were changed forever by the mine tailings that were carelessly dumped into them for 50 years. Today those rivers often look pretty good in lots of ways. They're loved, they're valued, they're being carefully revegetated in lots of cases. The Ovens has even been recognized by the Victorian government as a heritage river. But the rivers are not what they once were, and the changes are more than just cosmetic. It's not just the vegetation, it's the rivers and the floodplains themselves. Mining has a very long shadow. We can celebrate and reimagine these rivers, but we do that best when we understand the river's recent human history. Thank you.